Are you curious about the law of wrongful termination? Good. I'm an employment lawyer, and in this video, I'm going to break down what the legal definition is of wrongful termination. If you make it to the end of this video, you'll understand what lawyers mean when they say wrongful termination, and how the legal definition of wrongful termination may differ from the plain meaning of the phrase. So stick around. Nothing in this video is legal advice. If you think you were wrongfully terminated from your job, talk to a lawyer in your jurisdiction. If you're in Washington, feel free to reach out to my firm. The link to my website is in the description below. Okay, let's get started. The term wrongful termination can be a little confusing because it can have several different meanings. For instance, any illegal termination can be called wrongful. So you might refer to an illegal termination as a wrongful termination. But many of these illegal reasons for terminating an employee have other names under the law. And while these illegal reasons for terminating an employee are wrongful, they're not necessarily what we're talking about when we say wrongful termination in the law. For example, if an employer fires a worker because of that worker's protected characteristics, like the worker's age, race, gender, disability, LGBTQ status, that's an illegal termination because it violates anti-discrimination statutes. So you might call that kind of termination a wrongful termination, but usually under the law, we just refer to that as discrimination. And it's also illegal for an employer to fire a worker because the worker reported harassment or discrimination at work. If an employer fires a worker for reporting harassment or discrimination, it violates anti-retaliation laws. And while it's illegal, so you might call it wrongful termination, we refer to that simply as retaliation under the law. So then, what is the legal definition of wrongful termination under the law? Well, at this point in my videos, I usually put a statute on the screen so we can actually look at what the law says. But I can't do that for wrongful termination because wrongful termination isn't in a statute. Wrongful termination is what's called a common law claim, meaning it's a judge-created rule. Judges created the wrongful termination cause of action to fill the gaps left behind by statutes. So while most illegal reasons for terminating an employee are contained in statutes like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or state-specific anti-discrimination statutes, those statutes don't encompass every illegal reason for firing a worker. So judges created the wrongful termination cause of action to fill the gaps left behind by those statutes. And judges in Washington, along with many other states, have agreed that wrongful termination arises in two scenarios most often. First, violations of public policy. That's when an employer fires a worker for a reason that violates public policy. And second, breach of contract. That's when an employer fires a worker for a reason that breaches the employee's contractual rights. So let's go over each of these reasons. So what is a violation of public policy? To answer that question, we first have to address what the court means when it says public policy. And here in Washington State, the Washington Supreme Court in Dycombs v. State defined public policy like this. Public policy concerns what is right and just and what affects the citizens of the state collectively. So if an employer fires a worker that contravenes something that is right and just and affects the citizens of the state collectively, that violates public policy. And courts agree that this is a shifting area of the law. We don't have a set list of public policies because there might be new public policies or public policies that we haven't thought of yet. Luckily, courts have found 4 general areas that most public policies fit into, and I'll go over those now. First, refusing to commit an illegal act. Second, performing a public duty. Third, exercising a legal right. And fourth, reporting employer misconduct, also known as whistleblowing. An example of a worker refusing to commit an illegal act would be a manager who gets an order to discriminate against a worker and refuses to do it. Discrimination is illegal, so the manager is refusing to commit an illegal act. Another example from the case law happened when an employee refused to lie under oath. The employer directed the employee to lie under oath, and the employer refused to do it. So when a worker refuses to commit an illegal act, and the employer fires the worker for doing that, that violates public policy. An example of a worker performing a public duty would be a worker doing any civic duty, like serving on a jury or appearing before court under subpoena. When a worker is fired for performing a public duty, that violates public policy. An example of exercising a legal right would be a worker filing a workers' compensation claim, or a worker being fired for engaging in union activity. Workers have a legal right to do those things. And if the employer fires a worker for exercising that legal right, that violates public policy. An example of reporting employer misconduct would be reporting any illegal or unethical behavior by the employer, like safety violations, financial misconduct, environmental violations, and violations of wage laws, just to name a few. But these 4 categories are not an exhaustive list of public policies. And my examples are not an exhaustive list either. If a worker is fired for engaging in some public policy behavior that is not on that list, the worker can still prevail in a claim of wrongful termination with a good employment lawyer that can show that an important public policy existed that the employer violated when it fired the worker. Wrongful termination also occurs when an employer fires a worker for a reason that violates the worker's contractual rights. These contractual rights usually arise under the following 2 scenarios. First, implied or express contracts that limit the reasons why the employer can fire the worker. And second, employee handbook procedures. First, for express or implied contracts, employers and workers are free to enter into contracts that limit the reasons why the employer can fire the worker. Most commonly, these contracts contain a for-cause provision. That just means that the employer has to have cause to fire the worker. And if the employer fires the worker for some arbitrary reason without cause, that violates the worker's contractual rights, and that's wrongful termination. But these for-cause provisions aren't very common for most workers. Unionized workers have for-cause provisions often, and high-paid executives and entertainers also have for-cause provisions sometimes. But most other workers do not have for-cause provisions because for-cause provisions take a lot of the power away from employers, and employers don't like to do that. Next, employers may have a handbook that they give to employees that contains a promise for specific treatment in specific situations. For instance, an employee handbook may contain a discipline policy that outlines the steps the employer has to take before terminating an employee. If an employee relies on that handbook procedure and the employer violates it when it terminates the employee, that could violate the employee's contractual rights, which is wrongful termination. So now you know what wrongful termination means under the law. While there are many forms of termination that are wrongful because they are illegal, like retaliation or discrimination, the term wrongful termination under the law usually refers to a violation of public policy or a breach of the employee's contractual rights. If you are interested in learning more about wrongful termination, check out my guide in the description below. I wrote a detailed guide outlining the law of wrongful termination. I go over how to prove wrongful termination, how much you can expect to get if you win a claim of wrongful termination, and what to do if you were wrongfully terminated. And if you think you were wrongfully terminated, talk to a lawyer in your jurisdiction. If you're in Washington, feel free to reach out to my firm. My website is in the description below. And if you like this video, share it with other workers and subscribe to my YouTube channel. I make weekly videos explaining the laws that protect workers. Okay, that's all for me this week. See you next time.